My fiancée and her parents publicly mocked my late father at rehearsal dinner, so I canceled the wedding in front of everyone without hesitation. I'm 29, and I thought I'd found the woman I'd spend the rest of my life with. Her name was Sarah, and we'd been together for 3 years when I proposed last winter. She had this incredible laugh and this way of making even the most ordinary moments feel special. At least that's what I thought until everything came crashing down at our rehearsal dinner. Let me tell you about my dad first, because this whole story revolves around him. His name was Robert, and he was the kind of man who could fix anything with his bare hands and a toolbox. He was a plumber by trade, but he was so much more than that to everyone who knew him. Dad had this quiet strength about him, and he never met a problem he couldn't solve or a person he wouldn't help. Growing up, it was just me and him after my mom passed when I was 12. Dad stepped up in ways I didn't even realize until I became an adult myself. He'd wake up at 5 in the morning to make sure I had breakfast before school, then work 10-hour days, and still manage to help me with homework at night. When other kids' parents missed their baseball games, Dad was there in his work clothes cheering from the bleachers. The thing about my dad was that he wasn't fancy or sophisticated in the way Sarah's family valued those things. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation, and his idea of fine dining was the local diner where everyone knew his name. But he taught me everything that mattered about being a man. He showed me how to treat people with respect, how to work hard for what you want, and how to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult. Dad passed away 2 years ago from a heart attack. It happened so suddenly that I barely had time to process it. One day we were planning to go fishing that weekend, and the next day I was planning his funeral. I've never felt lost like that before. It was like losing my compass and my foundation all at once. Sarah was there for me during the worst of it, or at least I thought she was. She held me when I cried and helped me sort through his belongings. She even suggested we keep his old toolbox, which meant the world to me at the time. Looking back now, I wonder if she was just going through the motions, because that's what girlfriends are supposed to do. When I started planning the proposal, I knew I wanted to incorporate something of my dad's into it. I ended up using his mother's ring, the one he'd given to my mom all those years ago. It wasn't the biggest diamond or the most expensive setting, but it had history and meaning. When I got down on one knee and told Sarah the story behind the ring, she cried and said yes immediately. That should have been my first red flag. Not the yes part, but what happened afterward. Within a week of getting engaged, Sarah started talking about getting a new ring. She said she loved the sentiment, but maybe we could use the diamond in a more modern setting. Something that would photograph better for social media, she said with that laugh that used to charm me. I told her I'd think about it, but honestly the request stung. That ring represented 3 generations of love in my family, and she wanted to tear it apart and remake it. I should have seen it as a preview of what was coming, but I was too caught up in wedding planning to pay attention to the warning signs. Sarah's parents, Richard and Margaret, were what you'd call old money. Not billionaire level, but wealthy enough that they'd never had to worry about anything practical in their lives. Richard inherited his father's accounting firm, and Margaret spent her days organizing charity events and shopping. They lived in this perfectly manicured world where image was everything, and they made sure everyone knew it. From the moment I met them, I could tell they thought Sarah was settling for me. It wasn't anything they said directly, but there were always these little comments. Richard would ask about my work repairing HVAC systems, and then make some joke about getting his hands dirty. Margaret would talk about their country club friends and how accomplished their children were, as if she was trying to remind me that I didn't measure up. Sarah never stood up for me during these moments. She'd just laugh it off or change the subject. When I brought it up with her later, she'd say I was being too sensitive or that her parents were just trying to get to know me better. I started to realize that standing up to her parents wasn't something Sarah had ever learned how to do. The wedding planning process revealed more cracks in what I thought was our solid relationship. Every decision seemed to go through Richard and Margaret first. The venue, the flowers, the menu, all of it had to meet their standards. When I suggested including some of my dad's favorite songs in the reception playlist, Sarah said they weren't really appropriate for the tone they were going for. I should have called things off right then, but I kept telling myself that once we were married, things would be different. Sarah would learn to put our relationship first, and her parents would eventually warm up to me. I convinced myself that love was supposed to be hard work sometimes, and that fighting for us was the noble thing to do. Looking back, I can see how naive I was, but at the time I thought I was being patient and understanding. As the wedding approached, the dynamics with Sarah's family became more obvious and more uncomfortable. Richard and Margaret took over planning the rehearsal dinner, which should have been our responsibility as the couple. They insisted on hosting it at their country club and made it clear that they were paying for everything, so they'd make all the decisions. I tried to suggest a few things like maybe having it somewhere more casual where my small group of friends and family would feel comfortable, but Margaret shut that down immediately. She said the country club was elegant and that this was an important social event, not just a casual dinner. Sarah sided with her parents, saying they were being generous and I should be grateful. The guest list for the rehearsal dinner was another source of tension. Most of the people invited were from Sarah's side, which I understood since her family was much larger than mine. But when I looked at the final list, I realized that several of my dad's closest friends hadn't been included. These were men who had been like uncles to me growing up, and I really wanted them there. When I brought this up to Sarah, she said the venue had limited seating and her parents had already confirmed the numbers. She suggested I invite them to the wedding instead, but that wasn't the same thing. The rehearsal dinner was supposed to be intimate with the people who mattered most, and these men had mattered to my dad, which meant they mattered to me. I ended up calling a few of Dad's friends myself and asking them to come. Margaret wasn't happy about the last-minute additions, but she didn't make a scene about it. At least not then. She just made one of her passive-aggressive comments about how challenging it was to accommodate unexpected changes. The week leading up to the rehearsal dinner, I started having doubts about the whole thing. Not just the dinner, but the marriage itself. Sarah and I were barely talking because every conversation seemed to turn into an argument about wedding details. She was stressed about pleasing her parents, and I was frustrated about feeling like an outsider in my own wedding. My best friend Danny tried to talk some sense into me. He'd known me since high school and had been there through everything with my dad. Danny pulled me aside after work one day and said he was worried about me. He said Sarah seemed to care more about the wedding than about marrying me, and that her parents were treating me like hired help instead of their future son-in-law. I defended Sarah because that's what you do when you love someone, but deep down I knew Danny was right. The woman I'd fallen in love with 3 years ago seemed to have disappeared somewhere in the wedding planning process. Every decision was about appearances and status instead of about us building a life together. The night before the rehearsal dinner, Sarah and I had our biggest fight yet. We were at her apartment going over the seating chart when she casually mentioned that she'd moved my dad's friends to a table in the back corner. She said her parents thought it would be better to have the more prominent guests closer to the head table. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These men had helped raise me after my mom died, and now they were being shuffled to the corner like they didn't matter. When I told Sarah how hurtful this was, she rolled her eyes and said I was being dramatic. She said it was just seating and that no one would even notice where people were sitting. That's when I realized that Sarah truly didn't understand what she was asking me to do. She was asking me to treat the people who'd been there for me my entire life as second-class citizens at my own rehearsal dinner. And she couldn't see why that would bother me. We argued until almost midnight with neither of us backing down. Sarah kept saying her parents were just trying to make the evening elegant and successful. I kept trying to explain that success to me meant having the people I cared about feel welcomed and valued. We were speaking completely different languages. I went home that night wondering if I was making a huge mistake. Not just about the seating chart, but about everything. Marriage is supposed to be about two people choosing each other above everyone else, but I was starting to feel like I'd always come third behind Sarah and her parents' expectations. The morning of the rehearsal dinner, I woke up with a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I kept thinking about my dad and how excited he would have been about this day. He'd always wanted to see me settled and happy, and I wondered what he'd think about Sarah and her family. Danny called to check on me, and I found myself telling him about the seating chart situation. He was quiet for a long time before he said something that stuck with me. He told me that my dad had always put me first no matter what anyone else thought, and that I deserved someone who would do the same thing for me. I spent the day trying to convince myself that I was overthinking everything. Sarah and I were just stressed about the wedding, and once it was over we could get back to being happy together. Her parents would settle down once they realized I wasn't going anywhere, and we'd find our rhythm as a married couple. But as I got dressed for the dinner that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go very wrong. I kept thinking about my dad's friends sitting in the back corner and about how Sarah had dismissed my concerns so easily. I was walking into what was supposed to be a celebration, but it felt more like walking into enemy territory. I had no idea just how right that feeling would turn out to be. The rehearsal dinner started exactly as I'd expected it would. Richard and Margaret had transformed the country club's private dining room into something that looked more like a corporate event than a family celebration. Everything was perfectly arranged and intimidatingly formal. The kind of setup that made you worry about using the wrong fork or laughing too loudly. My small group of family and friends looked as uncomfortable as I felt. Danny had worn his best suit, but I could see him checking the price of everything with his eyes. My dad's friends Jim and Marcus were sitting at their assigned table in the corner, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. My Aunt Claire, who'd helped raise me after Dad died, was trying to make conversation with Sarah's relatives, but the cultural gap was obvious. Sarah looked beautiful in her rehearsal dinner dress, but she seemed more focused on making sure everything was perfect than on spending time with me. She kept checking with her mother about timing and logistics instead of just enjoying the moment. Every time I tried to pull her aside for a quiet conversation, she'd remind me that we needed to stick to the schedule. The dinner itself was fine if you enjoy pretentious food served in tiny portions. I watched my dad's friends picking at their salmon and probably thinking about the burger joint where we used to take me as a kid. These were good men who'd worked hard their whole lives, and they deserved better than being treated like charity cases at my own rehearsal dinner. Richard stood up first to make his toast. He tapped his champagne glass with a silver knife and waited for the room to quiet down. Then he launched into what sounded like a prepared speech about Sarah's accomplishments and bright future. He talked about her education, her career, and her potential like he was presenting a business proposal instead of celebrating his daughter's love. When Richard finally got around to mentioning me, it was clear he'd been dreading that part of the speech. He said something about how Sarah had chosen to marry me despite their concerns, and how they hoped I'd be able to provide for her in the way she deserved. The room got uncomfortable quiet, and I felt my face burning with embarrassment. But that was just the warm-up act. Margaret stood up next with her own glass, and that smile she wore when she was about to say something cutting. She started by talking about how important family traditions were and how the country club had hosted celebrations for their family for 3 generations. Then Margaret shifted into what she probably thought was a funny story about meeting me for the first time. She described how I'd shown up to Sunday dinner wearing work boots because I'd come straight from a job site. She made it sound like I'd been deliberately trying to offend them instead of just being honest about who I was. The story got worse from there. Margaret went on to describe how I'd talked about my dad during that dinner and how I'd mentioned that he'd taught me everything I knew about fixing things. She said it with this condescending tone, like manual labor was something to be ashamed of. Then she said the words that changed everything. Margaret raised her glass and said they were grateful that Sarah would have the opportunity to elevate me from my humble beginnings. She said my father had done his best with what he had, but that Sarah's family could offer me opportunities Robert never could have provided. The room went dead silent. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach, and I couldn't breathe properly. She hadn't just insulted me, she'd insulted my dad's memory in front of everyone who mattered to both of us. My hands were shaking, and I could feel Danny staring at me from across the room. Sarah was smiling like nothing had happened. She raised her own glass and clinked it against her mother's like they'd just shared some kind of inside joke. That's when I realized that this hadn't been an accident or a misunderstanding. Sarah had let her mother plan this humiliation, and she was perfectly fine with it. I looked over at Jim and Marcus and saw the anger in their faces. These men had loved my father like a brother, and they'd just watched someone mock his memory at his son's rehearsal dinner. My Aunt Claire looked like she was about to cry or start throwing things. Margaret wasn't finished, though. She kept going with her toast, saying how fortunate it was that Sarah could help me become the kind of man who belonged in their social circle. She said Robert had been a simple man with simple dreams, but that their family could help me aspire to something greater. That's when something inside me snapped. I stood up so fast that my chair fell over backward, and the sound echoed through the quiet room. Every eye in the place turned to me, and I could see Sarah's face going pale as she realized something was wrong. I didn't yell or make a scene right away. I just stood there for a moment looking at Margaret, then at Richard, then at Sarah. These people had taken what was supposed to be a celebration of love and turned it into an opportunity to humiliate me and dishonor my father's memory. And my future wife had not only allowed it to happen, she'd participated in it. The room stayed silent, waiting to see what I would do next. I could feel my heart pounding and my face burning, but my mind was crystal clear. I knew exactly what needed to happen, and there was no going back from it. I took a deep breath and looked around the room at all the faces staring at me. Some looked confused, some looked uncomfortable, and a few looked like they knew exactly what was coming. Danny had this expression that said he was ready to back me up no matter what happened next. I turned to Margaret first because she was the one who'd started this whole mess. I kept my voice calm and steady even though every muscle in my body was tense with anger. I told her that my father Robert was twice the person she'd ever be and that he'd taught me more about integrity and decency than her entire family seemed to understand. Margaret's face went white, and she started to stammer something about not meaning any offense, but I cut her off. I said that anyone who would mock a dead man at his son's rehearsal dinner didn't deserve the benefit of the doubt. I told her that my dad had built a life through honest work and treating people with respect, while she'd inherited everything she had and used it to look down on better people than herself. Richard tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand and kept going. I turned to him and said that his concerns about me providing for Sarah were noted, but that I'd never ask him for a penny. I said real men didn't need other people's money to take care of their families, and that my father had proven that every single day of his life. Then I turned to Sarah, and that's when my voice finally started to shake. I told her that I'd watched her sit there and smile while her mother disrespected the man who raised me. I said I'd spent 3 years thinking she was the woman I wanted to build a life with, but that I'd been wrong about who she really was. Sarah finally found her voice and tried to say that her mother hadn't meant it the way it sounded. She said they were just trying to be welcoming and that I was overreacting to what was meant to be a compliment. But I was done listening to excuses and explanations that didn't make sense. I told Sarah that her mother had called my father simple and suggested that I needed elevating from my humble beginnings. I asked her how that was supposed to be welcoming or complimentary. I asked her how she could sit there and let someone talk about the man who'd sacrificed everything to raise me like he was some kind of charity case. Sarah started crying and reached for my hand, but I stepped back. I told her that marriage was supposed to be about two people choosing each other above everyone else, but that she'd chosen her parents' approval over my dignity. I said I couldn't spend the rest of my life wondering when she'd throw me under the bus again to keep them happy. The room was so quiet you could hear people breathing. I could see some of Sarah's relatives looking embarrassed while others just looked annoyed that I was causing a scene. But when I looked at my dad's friends, I saw something different. I saw pride and approval, and that gave me the strength to finish what I'd started. I told everyone in the room that there wasn't going to be a wedding. I said I wouldn't marry into a family that had so little respect for me or for the memory of the man who made me who I was. I thanked the few people who'd actually shown up to support me and told them they were welcome to stay and enjoy the expensive dinner, but that I was leaving. Margaret finally recovered enough to speak, and she said I was making the biggest mistake of my life. She said Sarah was the best thing that had ever happened to me, and that I'd regret throwing it all away over a misunderstanding. But I told her there was no misunderstanding. I'd heard exactly what she meant, and I'd seen exactly who they all were when they thought they could get away with it. Sarah was sobbing now and begging me to sit down so we could talk about this privately. She said we could work through it if I'd just give her a chance to explain. But I told her that some things couldn't be explained away. I said that watching her smile while her mother mocked my father had shown me everything I needed to know about our future together. I walked over to the corner table where Jim and Marcus were sitting and shook both their hands. I thanked them for coming and told them how much it would have meant to my dad to have them there. Jim squeezed my shoulder and said Robert would be proud of how I'd handled myself. Marcus nodded and said I'd done the right thing standing up for family. Danny was already getting up to leave with me, and my Aunt Claire was grabbing her purse. A few other people from my side started heading for the door too. I could hear Margaret behind me saying something about how embarrassing this was, but I didn't turn around to respond. As we walked out of the dining room, I felt this incredible weight lifting off my shoulders. For months, I'd been trying to force myself to fit into Sarah's world and her family's expectations. I'd been bending over backward to prove I was worthy of their acceptance, while they'd been looking for ways to put me in my place. Outside in the parking lot, Danny put his hand on my back and said that was the most impressive thing he'd ever seen me do. My Aunt Claire hugged me tight and said my father would have been so proud of me for standing up for him and for myself. Jim and Marcus both said they'd never doubted I had Robert's backbone, and that tonight had proved it. I spent the next few weeks dealing with the fallout. Sarah called and texted constantly, trying to get me to change my mind. She said her mother was willing to apologize and that we could start over if I'd just forgive this one mistake. But it wasn't one mistake, it was a pattern of disrespect that I'd been ignoring for too long. 6 months later, I'm living in my own place and building a life that would make my dad proud. I'm still fixing HVAC systems, and I'm not ashamed of it. I've started dating someone who thinks my work ethic is attractive instead of embarrassing, and who would never let anyone disrespect my family's memory. Looking back, I realized that calling off the wedding was the best decision I ever made. My father taught me to stand up for what's right even when it's hard, and that night, I finally learned what he meant. Some things are more important than keeping the peace, and honoring the people who made you who you are is definitely one of them.